In the year 1985, Los Angeles was terrorized by a series of rapes and murders. Men, women, the elderly and children were all in the sadistic killer's sights. There was a serial murderer who broke all the rules. The attacker was christened the Night Stalker and would go down in history as one of the most horrible serial killers. But who was the Night Stalker? On the 17th of March 1985, a young homicide detective of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was called to an incident in the Rosemead district. He thought it was a routine homicide with 1 dead and 1 wounded. This murder was anything but routine. When they entered the location, Gil Carrillo, who was the co-lead detective, found Dale Okazaki lying in the kitchen in a pool of blood. She had sustained a gunshot wound to the head. She had been unloading groceries when a man entered her apartment and executed her. Dale's flatmate, 22-year-old Maria Hernandez, was also shot at point-blank range while pulling into the garage. She survived because the bullet ricocheted off of her car keys when she lifted her hand to shield herself. Unfortunately, she did not recognize her attacker. Nothing had been taken from the property. Little did they know that about 30 minutes later the same killer had struck again. In nearby Monterey Park, 30-year-old law student Cy Leanne had been driving home when another driver forced her to stop and shot her twice in the chest at close range and ran. The nature of the crimes was not typical of a serial killer. On the morning of March 27th, the bodies of 64-year-old Vincent Zazzara and his 44-year-old wife were discovered in their home. The same gun had been used. However, the behavior at the crime scene was significantly different. Vincent had been shot while he slept. This awoke Maxine, who slept next to him. Richard hopped onto her, beat her and bound her hands. He then demanded she tell him where all the valuables in the house were. While Maxine had been tied down, Ramirez ransacked the house for any valuables. She was able to get out of the bonds and got under the bed where there was a shotgun. When he came back, she tried shooting him, but unfortunately, there weren't any bullets in the gun. This infuriated Ramirez and he proceeded to shoot her 3 times. He gouged her eyes out, put them in a jewelry box and left. Outside, he left his footprints in the flower bed. The bullets at the scene matched those found in previous attacks. On May 14, 1985, the killer appeared to have struck again. At the home of William and Lily Doe, a couple in their mid-60s, were scattered casings on the living room floor. William was in bed shot dead. Mrs. Doe was in another room, sexually assaulted. She had been restrained with thumb cuffs, beaten, terrorized and raped, but the killer had let her live. Detective Garillo suspected that only one killer performed all these murders and despicable acts. 6 weeks later, in the city of Monrovia, in the home of 2 80-year-old sisters, Mabel and Florence was discovered in the home they shared. One had been raped. Both had been severely beaten by a hammer. He electrocuted both of them with a cord. But there was something else that was new. The aspect of the occult. On their wall, there were some writings and a drawing of the pentagram. There were also markings on the body. The press dubbed the mystery killer the Night Stalker. Everyone who had known him said they never suspected he was that kind of person. It was said he was an ordinary child, friendly, nice and very funny. His reign of terror had only just begun. The Night Stalker preyed on unsuspecting citizens, taking glee in rape, murder and mutilation. Who was the Night Stalker? Richard Ramirez was born on the 29th of February 1960, the last of 5 children to Mexican immigrants living in the Texan border town of El Paso. It was a quiet town with a heavy Hispanic population. His mother, Mercedes, worked at a boot factory and his father, Julian, was an Army veteran who worked on the Santa Fe Railway. He had a violent temper and was away from the family often. When he was 2 years old, a dresser fell on his head when he was reaching for a radio. This left him with 30 stitches and a concussion. 3 years later, a swing left him unconscious when it hit him on the head at the playground. He was rushed to hospital again. When he turned 10, he appeared to have slightly changed. He would have seizures in school. He was diagnosed with epilepsy, a condition that would affect him much of his school life. This may have caused him to have disturbing visions and vivid dreams, experts say. As he approached his teens, he began to be distant from his father and looked up to his cousin Mike, who was a Vietnam veteran who boasted of many atrocities while in service. The cousin had a box of mementos that had pictures of at least 20 women he was raping or the heads he was cutting off. It was a fascination to him. In the years when his sexuality was being formed, Ramirez was exposed to images of rape, torture and murder. In his young mind, there was a fusion of sex and aggression. Ramirez later said that his cousin Mike gave him a front row seat of his brutality. He taught Ramirez how to kill people and how to capture them as well. On May 4, 1973, Richard Ramirez was at his cousin's house. He watched his cousin shoot his wife in his apartment after a petty argument. Ramirez was fascinated by this. This is when he became obsessed with killers, crime, murder and death. After this incident, Ramirez moved to live with his sister and her husband. Roberto, who was his sister's husband, was a peeping Tom and would take Richard with him at night to peep in the windows of neighbors where women whom they considered attractive were living. They would watch these women undress or just watch them go about their own business. In his high school years, Ramirez changed dramatically. He stopped hanging out with his former friends and started hanging out with boys who did drugs. He became interested in hard rock and Satanism. He dropped out of school and began living on the fringes of society, sometimes sleeping in the local cemetery. He became a thief after the attempted rape of a guest in an El Paso hotel where he worked. He dropped out of high school. Ramirez moved to California at the age of 22. He became a cocaine and alcohol addict. He became a criminal. From taking drugs, using prostitutes, stealing cars, breaking and entering, he did it all. By May 1985, Richard Ramirez had killed at least 8 times and his violent home invasions were about to escalate, plunging the people of Los Angeles into panic. The people of Los Angeles were no longer safe in their homes. The dreadful and indiscriminate nature of the crimes caused a wave of fear. Gun sales in the summer of 1985 went up as people made sure they slept with their windows closed. But still, the violent attacks continued. In Burbank, on May 30th, a 41-year-old woman was raped as her 12-year-old son was locked and handcuffed in a closet. She was allowed to live. On the 27th of June, the body of a 28-year-old teacher was found in Arcadia. She was sodomized and her throat slit. On July 2nd, again in Arcadia, a 75-year-old woman was found dead. She had been beaten, her throat cut and her home ransacked. Detective Carrillo was convinced that just one man was at work, but the FBI insisted that different weapons were used, which was unlike of a serial killer. On July 5th, the Night Stalker targeted a quiet suburban street in Sierra Madre. He entered the bedroom of 16-year-old schoolgirl Whitney Bennett. He confronted her in her bed while she was asleep, beat her with a tire iron, tried to strangle her and left her for dead. She survived, but 4 feet of sutures ended up in her head. On the 7th of July, in the sweltering heat of the night, Detective Carrillo awoke convinced the Night Stalker was in his own home. He had left the windows open due to the heat, just as the other many residents in the area. His house wasn't attacked, but his phone rang, startling him. It was work calling. They asked him to call Linda Martinez, who was a crime scene investigator. Linda's neighbor was calling out for help. Linda went to the back fence and called out across the street to the neighbor that informed her that she had been robbed and raped and handcuffed to her bed. In a nearby home, 61-year-old Joyce Nelson was found dead, beaten by a blunt object. The Night Stalker had struck twice in one night. He would repeat the trick 2 weeks later, on the 20th of July, shooting Max and Layla Niding at their home in Glendale before moving on to Sun Valley. By August of 1985, the Night Stalker had killed at least 13, terrorized Los Angeles County, and pushed investigators to their limits. He appeared on the move, and that made it even more difficult for them to catch him. On August 24, Richard Ramirez was lurking outside of a home outside of Los Angeles. There was a 13-year-old boy on the inside called James who heard footsteps outside his window. Since the police had released information about this Night Stalker, James knew who he was. He therefore ran to his parents and alerted them. His parents made noise which startled Ramirez, who fled via a car which had been stolen. James ran outside the house and noted down the color, make and model of the car, and some characters on the license plate. They called the police and handed over everything they knew. He later went to the home of Bill Carnes and shot him, but he survived. He raped Inez Erickson but left her alive so that she could tell people the Night Stalker was there. The information Inez gave to the police was instrumental in giving a detailed description of Richard to the police. On August 28, the car was found, and even though Ramirez wiped down the fingerprints on other parts of the vehicle, a fingerprint on the rearview mirror of a car he had stolen was found. It belonged to Richard Ramirez. On the morning of the 31st of August 1985, Ramirez arrived in Los Angeles after visiting a brother in Arizona. He walked past police officers keeping his head low who were staking out the bus terminal in hopes of catching the serial killer should he attempt to flee on an outbound bus. He walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles and noticed people looking at him. He was unaware he had become the lead story in virtually every major newspaper and television program across California. He then looked at the newspapers on the counter, and each one of them had his pictures. Then a group of elderly Hispanic women fearfully said, "It is him. El Matador," which is Spanish for killer. Ramirez panicked and fled. He tries 2 carjackings but fails. On Hubbard Street, he tried to carjack a woman who screamed. Residents heard the screams and ran after the tall, dark-haired guy. They caught up to him and surrounded him and beat him relentlessly. One of the residents had hit him and he was bleeding. The police caught up to him, and for the first time, they came face to face with him. Detectives questioned him and he revealed he was well schooled in murder. According to detectives, he was very intelligent even though he dropped out of school in the 9th grade. He was very interested in murder and killing and past serial killers and could tell you everything about them. He was taken to his first cell, and upon the realization that this cell had once belonged to Angelo Buono, who was one part of the El Cid Strangler duo, he was very excited. In August 1988, at his first court appearance, Ramirez showed his hand to the press. There he carved a pentagram on his hand and yelled, "Hail Satan." Despite all his crimes, Ramirez had fans and even people who loved him. In fact, a lady named Doreen wrote him over 75 letters, and they were supposedly in love. Richard proposed to her and married her on October 3, 1996. Doreen said, "He's kind, he's funny, he's charming. I think he's a really great person. He's my best friend. He is my buddy." Many of these fans believed he was innocent. One of the jurors, a lady named Cindy, was infatuated with him, even sending letters to him in prison. After his conviction, she went ahead to do a few TV appearances insisting that he was poorly represented and he was innocent. On September 30, 1989, Richard Ramirez was found guilty of 13 murders, 11 sexual assaults, 5 attempted murders, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death. In June 2013, he died of complications secondary to B-cell lymphoma in a California hospital at the age of 53. He had been on death row for more than 23 years.